Okay, and we're back. Our next presenter is Dr. Erica Russell. Dr. Russell is a licensed psychologist and associate professor of psychology. Prior to her work in higher education, she enjoyed a diversity of professional experiences in varied settings, which include community agencies, practice, and school. Currently, she teaches African American psychology, developmental psychology, and careers in psychology at her second HBCU. She is a Robert C. Nesbum Honors College faculty member and serves as the faculty liaison for learning communities. She is a faculty advisor and mentor to undergraduate psychology students and integrates her passion for mentorship, mental health awareness, and culturally relevant pedagogy into the delivery of her Face It initiative. Dr. Russell is a proud native of Hampton Roads, Virginia, and she values the use of self as a change agent and believes that relevance is key to engagement. I'll say that again. Relevance is key to engagement. She enjoys time spent with family and close friends. In work and life in general, she seeks to answer the call to leave things better than she found them. Thank you, Dr. Russell.
Thank you, thank you. Now I am going to do the share screen. So if you all would just indulge me for a moment to get things into a proper perspective. Okay, are you all able to see? All right. So once again, thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to share with you. Greetings from Norfolk, Virginia. Today, I would like to talk to you all about removing barriers to build bridges with a particular focus on context, culture, and connection, because these are things that matter. During this session, I invite you to consider the significant role of culture and context for human service providers and their client partners. Most importantly, I invite you to a process of self-reflection, because as mentioned in my introduction, and as demonstrated by Ms. Moss Rogers, we often use ourselves as change agents. And so this is an opportunity for us to focus on ourselves in the work that we do. So before we get started, I would like to pose this question for our consideration. Are there barriers, and are we willing to build bridges? Do we encounter barriers in our work, and are we willing to build bridges? And if you would indulge me, I have just that one question because, you know, the title infers that there are barriers, right? That there may be some barriers that we experience, but I'm interested in knowing from your perspective, in your respective roles, are there barriers that you encounter within your settings and within your roles that impact your ability to connect with, understand, or to serve others? If you would just take a moment to think about it. If your answer is yes, feel free to share some examples in the chat. All right. I'm not sure if I'm able to see. Okay. So while we are reflecting on that, we know that a barrier is something that blocks and prevents us from moving forward. It may prevent us from going from point A to point B or to reaching some desired location. And then when we think about bridges, of course, I've taken borrowed an image of a bridge in an area that's local to me. Bridges are often created to help us to move from one place to another. I've selected this image of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel because it is to me, a great depiction of a bridge. They can originate on dry land, solid foundation. They can sometimes take us over water. They can be straight or curvy. They could take us under just to bring us up. And so I just wanted to think about that. And I'm noticing that there's a 91% thus far who have indicated that there are some barriers encountered, and a 9% of those who've responded indicated that, perhaps there aren't barriers, and that's an awesome place to be. But for many of us, there are some barriers that we might benefit from considering. And so now is where I'll share this aspirational outline for the session. And I'm calling it an aspirational outline because some of the content that I would endeavor to cover in a session like this, it may be a bit ambitious, but we will at least get into, I would say, enough to be able to generate some valuable reflection, to kind of remind us of some things that we probably already knew, or to invite us to start a journey that would cause us to engage in reflective process in an ongoing way. So I'm going to start off with sharing a bit about me. We're going to look at some language and some terms so that as I'm using them and as we're reflecting, we are using them in a similar way. We're going to cover some questions that will guide our consideration of ourselves as we reflect on culture, context, and connection. We're going to take some time to look at some things that some scholars had to say in an article that talks about the reality that one size does not fit all when we're working and serving others. And then we're going to do a little bit to talk about how do we build bridges. So the guiding questions, we will kind of use these guiding questions to kind of frame our consideration for the remainder of this particular session. The first is, how do we self-define or self-identify? How do we relate in the world? What has colored our lens? And who ultimately defines the problems, sets the goals and objectives, and in a lot of ways determines what success looks like within the context of the work that we do. And so here is a little bit about me. So again, I am Erica Russell. I am a native of Virginia in the area which was formerly the 804, affectionately known as the 757. I was born in Hampton, raised in Newport News, and finished out my formative years in Hampton, Virginia. I completed my undergraduate studies in Virginia at Old Dominion University. And so I'm pretty much a Virginia product, if you will. Although I did move on to the DC metro area to pursue my graduate studies. However, one of the most important things that I often share about myself and include in my scholarship, because I think it's important and it matters, is that I was a first generation college student. I share that too for a couple of reasons here, because there may be many of you who may find yourself similarly situated, but I include it as a part of my scholarly agenda because it continues to allow me to reflect on and to interrogate my lived experience based on me being first. And I look at it that way because once you were a first generation college student, you continue to move through career and profession and your developmental pathway being first in many respects. Thus, I've even gone on to define first as being individuals who were once first generation college students who successfully matriculated through their undergraduate degree programs and now find themselves navigating life in their respective personal and professional spaces. Now, I come from a working class background, and I grew up in a neighborhood that had some stereotypes and things associated with it. There were some preconceived notions often associated with growing up in the area where I grew up. And I found myself, as I reflect on my own experiences, being treated as someone who was exceptional at times. But my journey has allowed me, and my intentional reflective practice, or my personal identity, allows me to realize that there were discredited or maybe overlooked strengths within my community. There were discredited or overlooked strengths within my community. So even though I was first, it did not mean that I didn't have access to exposure to individuals who added value to the lived experiences of others, regardless of what their educational experience had been. So there were some situations and circumstances that were responded to based on preconceived notions and biases that we all carry, while the majority of my time is spent now teaching, as opposed to in clinical practice. I recognize that it is really important anytime that I have an opportunity to help others to reflect and grow and develop within their professional endeavors, that we are open to this process of self-reflection and learning from our own experiences and benefiting from all with whom we interact. It's also important that we recognize when we are seated in positions of privilege and power, and that we note that we are responsible in the ways in which we execute the duties that we take on in our jobs, as our careers, or within our service to the world. We're responsible for providing culturally relevant, culturally sensitive interventions or services. It's really important for us when we're talking about working with our youth, our youngest citizens. When we think about our own experiences, our lived experiences, our day-to-day experiences, a lot of times, even the way that we respond in the world currently is a function of things that we experienced during our childhood and during our adolescent years. And so, because we have the opportunity to work with children, with youth, and with families, it is really important, it is indeed imperative that we think about the things that we've encountered along our journey, the messages that we've received that have literally shaped us, and our ability to have impact, major impact on those who we get to serve, because our experiences kind of shape how we experience the world. I don't know if anyone has ever really decided to take some time and to reflect on their personal identities in an intentional way, but I have learned so much in my own practice, even as a professional, by being willing to engage in self-reflective practice. And I hope that you all would be willing to do the same. So that leads us to this guiding question. How do you self-define? How do you self-define? How often, if ever, have you intentionally reflected on your personal journey and how it connects to what you do and how you do it? Who have been the key players, and what have been the critical experiences that make you, you? What do you value? What gets under your skin? These are some helpful things to consider, because we've all probably heard the saying, everywhere you go, there you are. And that is one of the truest statements around. It is important for us to reflect on these things, because in the work of helping or human services, we are, or at least we should be, co-constructing outcomes for those who we get to serve. This is especially important when serving young, developing populations, because as was mentioned earlier, their bodies and brains are literally still growing and maturing in response to both biology and the environment. Their early experiences are like layaway or deposits placed on their continuing and future development and life experiences. And that is this, that goes, that is the same for us as well, excuse me. So next, let's get some common language. And by this, I simply mean we will review some definitions of terms being used so that we can have a mutual understanding. And while I will share these terms like a scholar introducing concepts in our work with our diverse populations, it is most appropriate for us to do the same. In our rapport building and desire to truly understand, it is appropriate that we are honest when we need to clarify our understanding, even around the meaning of words, even ones that may seem common. So even the words that we use all the time, just because we all use the same word doesn't mean that it means the same. One of the things that kind of resonated for me as I listened to the last presentation was that even from an intergenerational perspective, we can have some different understandings. And so being willing to define terms, to make sure that we have an understanding of what they mean to one another is important. So for the purposes of the presentation, I'm sharing this so that you will have an understanding of where I'm coming from. But even in our work with our partners, our consumers, however we characterize those which we get to work alongside of, is important that we have some common language. And so in the title of this presentation, I talked about context, culture, and connection. And so when we think about context, we're thinking about the reality that we all exist within a number of different settings or different spaces. And the one thing that I will kind of emphasize here is that the spaces in which we are existing, be it within our communities, within our institutions, within families, within relationship, is important for us to note that our context does involve an interrelated series, interrelated set of conditions that surround the individual. So we exist as individuals, sure, but not in isolation, in other words. So context is our environment that which surrounds us. And those things are important because they include circumstances, situations, culture, and the like, which we will kind of continue to build on as we proceed. So context matters. Where we exist matters. Where we live matters. The environment matters. Our experience of the context matters. And it's important for us to note too that two people can exist within the same context or space and have a very different experience. Cultures are simply defined as people who are existing within a shared context, and we're going to unpack culture, and we'll be able to see how culture and context go hand in hand as well. All right, so I'm going to share a few different definitions of culture, you know, just from the basic dictionary definitions of culture to some other elements that have been unpacked a little bit more by other scholars. So culture has been defined as being a set of shared understandings, the way we do things. One of the important elements of culture that is important for us to note is that it is socially constructed and evolving. Evolving suggests that it is not stagnant. It is not hard set, concrete. It is something that is influenced and continues to evolve with time, and it is a function of those who are existing within it. It is socially constructed, meaning that it is not something that is a hard and fast, tangible thing. It is something that those social beings within it kind of create and maintain. And so culture, it also involves a number of different things. And so Castro pointed out some of these elements that are a little bit more in line with I guess, a more traditional definitions or conceptualizations of culture. So culture involves shared values, beliefs, customs, behaviors, and so forth, lifestyle. And a lot of times when people hear the word culture, they automatically think about things like race and ethnicity, but it's important for us to realize that culture, we exist even within various cultural contexts. And so even from an intergenerational perspective, certain generations have cultural characteristics that may be specific to their time and space, if you will. Culture involves similar relationship and social patterns, often common patterns or styles of communication, which is very important when we think about how we engage with folks and how, based on our own experiences, the way that we expect communication to look or go may vary. And we'll kind of get into some of that in a minute. Geographic location, as well as patterns of dress and diet, and all of those things are captured in culture as well. Some common characteristics of culture involve some similarities or consensus around these various categories that are important for us as we think about the work of human services, working with children, working with youth, working with families. And they include things like identity development. While there may be certain expectations around what that looks like, that in certain contexts or within certain demographics and so forth, there's variability there. Culture involves things like rites of passage, things that happen, traditions that occur once certain milestones have been met. There's culturally specific focus on things like ideas about sex and sexuality, religion and spirituality, patterns of interpersonal interaction. What does interpersonal interaction look like within specific cultural context? And perspectives on the role and status of children and families. And I'm going to pause here just for a moment, just to be sure that as I am sharing these characteristics, that you're thinking about yourselves within your roles, yourself as an individual first. Let's think about yourself as an individual and your own cultural lens. And again, we'll kind of continue to build on this as we proceed within the session, but think about your own ideas about these particular categories and your own cultural perspective, because that's going to be important to consider if we want to indeed remove barriers to build bridges. Okay, we have continuing other characteristics of culture, like coping behaviors may look a certain way within certain cultural contexts, patterns and perspectives on gender roles and relationships, means for establishing trust, credibility, and legitimacy, which are really important in the work that we do, view of the past and the future, and groups or individuals' sense of place in society and the world, assumptions, prejudices, and stereotypes of others. This is a laundry list. This is a laundry list of different characteristics of culture, But again, I invite you to think about these things because they have implications for how we experience the world and how we show up in our day-to-day functioning, to include our professional settings as well. And then connection. Connection was another word that we wanted to kind of consider and to unpack. Connection, it probably seems pretty straightforward. You know, it involves the reality that we do not exist in isolation. We are working with and serving other individuals, and so be it how we work and serve on multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams, how we work with the individuals and families that we're serving within our specific capacities or what have you. Ultimately, we are all connected in the experience. So we've talked about, we've considered context, you know, as the space in which we exist within. We've considered culture and various aspects of culture, and I have asked that you think about how you experience some of those different elements of culture, and then connection. Ultimately, we want to be able to think about aspects of those different categories, reflect on them to find out if, or to consider if any of our ideas and thoughts around any element of those constructs, or the actual elements such as identity or views on gender and sexuality, or how do we become credible, if there are things that we need to take a closer look at to determine if that is creating a barrier for us being able to connect and to help move over the bridge to the outcomes that we want for those who we're working with and that we're serving. And that kind of gets us to worldview, which is another of the constructs that I wanted us to consider. And this is the build-up. So if you all will kind of indulge me in considering these concepts, hopefully you'll be able to kind of see how this is helpful information for us to reflect on in order to help to move us forward. So when we're thinking about worldview, a lot of times, you know, the short and sweet definition that we hear of worldview is our lens through which we see the world, our lens through which we see the world. And Allison and Belgrave give us this nice definition also, which suggests that worldview is a way of thinking that organizes aspects of our lives that include our intra and interpersonal thoughts. So the thoughts that we have internally within ourselves, about ourselves, our thoughts that we have about others, and it also influences our behaviors and the way that we function in social systems and in institutions. So it is our lens, how we see the world, how we experience the world. It contributes to some of our automatic thoughts that we'll unpack a bit also. I invite you to maybe share within the chat some of the spaces in which our worldview is influenced. In other words, what are some of the things that you believe shapes an individual's worldview? And not just any individual's worldview, your own worldview. What are some of the things that shape our worldview? And when we reflect on that, I think that will give us some perspective as well. Let's see. I'm going to visit the chat because I see that there were some comments coming. All right. Religion, yes. Politics, trauma, yes. Learned behaviors from our family and traditions, cultural, religion, background, yes. Adverse child experiences, family, all of those things, all of those things. And media, yes, absolutely. And so when we think about the reality that we do have these things that create, we have these what we will call these cognitive containers, these schemas. If you think back to maybe some exposure that you've encountered as it relates to cognitive theory or cognitive behavioral theory and so forth. And we're reminded that, our mind from a cognitive theoretical perspective, we're reminded that we take in information and we store it, and it becomes a part of our schema. We have our self schema, and we have our schemas for the world that are influenced by all of those things that you all shared. Definitely our early childhood experiences, our socialization within our homes, within our communities, within our religious institutions, the messages that we receive through the media and so forth, all of those things absolutely do influence our worldview. And I mean, that's just a natural thing. And that kind of moves us to the question of how do we relate in the world and what has colored our lens. So I invited you to think about things that have contributed to your worldview. And you see, I have a couple of images there. I have the rose colored lens, the nice shades with the rose colored lenses, just to kind of capture the idea that some of us kind of look at the world or may experience the world through rose-colored glasses. And I think, one of the messages that kind of comes from that idea is that, sometimes, we put on a lens that allows us to see the things that we want to see, or just kind of focusing on the positive aspects of things without kind of recognizing that there are some other things that aren't so rosy. There are things that kind of impact our perspective in terms of how we view the world, and this can vary, based as a function of kind of how our day is going. Sometimes some things are more a function of our temperament and all those early experiences, but some of us may see the world as half empty. I mean, not the world is half empty, the glass is half empty, while others may see it as half full. And then some of us may just be very much looking at things practically. Well, there's a glass and 50% of the glass is filled with water. We just kind of focus kind of more so, tunnel vision or what have you, but it's important for us to know for ourselves, and reflect on how we relate within the world and how we see things. And that kind of turns me to this declaration. And that declaration is that bias is a thing. Bias is a thing. I know it's I would say I don't want to say it's a popular word. I know it's a term that has kind of gained a little bit more attention here in recent years, but let's define it. Bias has been defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered to be unfair. And you'll see that I have this declaration projected over what appears to be a book with blank pages, because the reality is that we're not blank pages. We aren't blank pages. We exist with all of the experiences that we've had, and there are things that kind of just happen to bias us, to have expectations around certain things almost automatically. Like it's not even something that we have to really put much thought into. It's just almost automatic. So bias is something that we have, that we live with, and it's pretty much a function of our lives that we've lived, that we have not existed in isolation. We exist within a context that is surrounded by people and experiences that we have had the opportunity to have up to this point. Then there's this notion of implicit bias. Implicit bias, it's another word that's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years. And I will share later some resources related to implicit bias that I think are really helpful for individuals who really want to gain some, I don't say perspective, but kind of engage and get some additional exposure to conversation related to this that they can apply to themselves and use in their work with others. But implicit bias, as defined in one of the videos that will be shared with you, has been described as thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments that you might not agree with, even if you were consciously aware of them. Sometimes those judgments may be based on race, and the speaker kind of goes on to describe it a little bit more in depth. But I do have a question that I want to pose and invite you all to kind of drop in the chat. Sometimes the judgments may be based on race, but what are some other areas where we may encounter bias or where implicit bias may surface? What are some other, I guess, targets of implicit bias that may be of importance for our consideration besides race? And you might notice that this image is foggy. It's foggy. Or at least you might not notice it. This is what it's intended to be. It's intended to represent a fog, because in one of the videos that I watched, they kind of talked about how, all of those things that you all shared and that we all shared around our early childhood experiences, our family, the ways that our families have socialized us, our learning experiences, so forth. I talked about it as it relates to a schema, but they also related it to our existing with this fog that's always there. It's always around us, even if we're not seeing it. And it kind of contributes to this bias that we're not aware of. It's kind of like that. If you think about it like that odor, the commercials when they talk about there's odor in the car, and they said that some of some of it we're not aware of because we've kind of gone nose. They call it nose blind in the commercials, but they're just like we become immune to it. Like we're not even without a thought. We just get in the car and move. Whereas someone else getting into the car may kind of get in and they might be like, oh, you've been to the gym. They might kind of notice that there's a smell or something that you didn't notice. And so I'm going to take a look. So implicit bias, I see some of the responses in the chat. Age, sex, SES, yes. Different abilities, yes. Mental health, income, SES, colorism, all of those things, absolutely. And it's almost automatic. It's almost automatic and it's there. And the thing about it is we all come to our work with with bias. And we also come to our work with a preference or a leaning. So even if it's not executed in a way that is operating in a direct act of judgment towards someone else, sometimes a barrier that we may experience is our tendency to move and operate in a way that suggests that there is a way that this should go. There is a way that this should go. And the way that we may be operating from in terms of the way that this should go may be a function of our own lenses, our own personal experiences. And sometimes it may be a function of that we are the trained professionals. We are the ones who have received the certificates of continuing education. We are the ones who have taken the courses, gotten the degrees, or what have you. And so it helps for us sometimes to really check in with ourselves about how we're engaging, especially when we're working with diverse populations and populations that are different from us. And when I say populations that are different from us, I almost hesitate to say that, because the truth of the matter is, even when we are from or maybe have experienced similar things, may share some identities, it doesn't mean that our experience is the same. I kind of liken it to, I don't know if you think about yourself, if you have siblings, two siblings can exist within a family and have a totally different experience of their parents and things of that nature. And so it's important for us to know that there is not a single one way to engage, that we as individuals, as change agents, need to sometimes hold up the mirror and kind of check in with ourselves to get in touch with our own thoughts and potential biases, and the degree of our openness, so that we can be sure to remove any barriers that may exist from the work that may prevent us from doing the work that we need to do for those who we get to serve. Because one size does not fit all, as I kind of referenced before. And this is when I'll kind of take a few moments to consider the work of Allegria and colleagues, who really kind of pointed out that there is a need to take diversity, culture, and context seriously. They offer some recommendations for providers, policymakers, and consumers in a report that they developed. And so I want to take a little bit of time to cover some of the recommendations that were given for providers. And then I want to highlight a couple of recommendations that they gave for consumers, and quite possibly consider some space for reflection on them. But before so doing, I just wanted to kind of point out that there are some cross-cutting factors that have been identified that have the potential to influence our cultural experiences. So these are things that have the potential to impact our cultural experiences as those who are the helpers, as well as, of course, those who we get to serve. But when we think about all of these different categories, where we have different worldviews, values, and traditions, to gender role expectations, to socioeconomic status and perspectives on health, illness, and healing, just as some examples, we would really I would say these are spaces for us to really recognize a need to seek to understand those who we are working with, and to be clear about our own perspectives, our own worldviews on some of these things that may show up and impact how we show up as helpers, as well as for us to identify those things that may be personally valuable or opportunities for engagement for those who we work with. And so I'm trying to think back to a question and comment that was I think it was a question that was posed during the last session. When we think about things about like how do we connect, maybe say if we're working with, attempting to work with a partner or a consumer or a collaborator in treatment, whatever, however we are characterizing the relationship between those with whom we work, it might be helpful for us to kind of have a sense of who are the key players from the individual's perspective. So, you know, there may be automatic thoughts that we may have in terms of who should be involved, but making sure that we have an understanding, a cultural understanding of those who are serving, so that we are not prescribing what we believe to be the best path to engagement or who needs to be involved, but creating more of a collaborative co-constructing of the helping experience. So here were some of the recommendations that were given for providers. And I'm gonna go through each of them and kind of just add a little bit of commentary, and then we'll get to the consumers piece. They recommended that those of us who are serving, that we improve our own awareness of the importance of cultural differences as a factor that affects treatment outcomes. Sometimes if we don't have an awareness of this in and of itself, lacking knowledge or consideration of the importance of cultural differences can be a barrier in and of itself. So this supports that cultural considerations are important when conceptualizing cases, developing goals and treatment planning, things of that nature, because individuals function within cultures and contexts that are important to their life process. So having an acknowledgement and awareness of the importance of cultural differences is important. Now, I would extend here that it is important in an ongoing, intentional way. A lot of times when it comes to cultural considerations, because, and I will start by saying, because of the nature of the work that many of us do or have done, you know, sometimes we are stretched, and our time may be limited or what have you, and maybe the only time we are really focusing intentionally on culture and such conversations as this is when we have opportunity for continuing education moment. So we definitely need to not just recognize this in moments, but incorporate this awareness into our day-to-day. Make providers mindful that as a member of a dominant and different culture, they can inadvertently be a part of the power dynamics that shape the reality of smaller communities. Here, I would just say it's important that we know and acknowledge our privilege and power, period. And I think that that's important because a lot of times, you know, even if we share similar identities, we are empowered by virtue of our roles. Accurately and validly capture the views of diverse cultural groups when assessing mental health or other matters of concern. And this, again, relates to the need to engage in ongoing cultural education so that we can develop our develop or use a lens of cultural understanding. And that cultural understanding should involve learning from members of the cultural group, learning from our clients, our collaborators, our partners in intentional ways. And I'm mindful of time, so I'm gonna kind of breeze through the last few of these. Be cognizant of how different communities are, different contexts are different. Seek understanding, avoid taking the views of our those who we get to serve for granted. We should never ever mute or disregard those who we serve. Ultimately, even though we may have had courses or trainings and have experiences, they are ultimately the experts on their lived experiences. And become conscious of one's complicity in reproducing power dynamics within the professional culture, if that applies. Really quickly, when we talk about our consumers or partners, collaborators, these were a couple of the things that were recommended for them. And I'm just gonna read through the first one. It says, activate and train youth on the importance of sharing with providers about their mental health problems or challenges and information linked to their core beliefs, approaches to life goals and expectations. And then in the second one, they talked about really emphasizing the importance of the caregivers and the youth and kind of sharing with providers so that they can understand the dynamics of their lived experiences and so forth. And while I see that as very valuable, I did have a bit of a concern about some of the wording, particularly when they talk about it, the latter part where it says that the clinician does not have to, so that the clinician does not have to use their preconceived notions. I understand the spirit of that recommendation, but I would like to say for us, as we are doing this work and we're desiring to be aware of ourselves and wanting to support diverse communities, I would, as hard as this may be to hear, it should not, if we have someone who is in need of support, who is in crisis, who may be dealing with an issue with substances or mental health or comorbid challenges, it should not be our clients, our collaborators' responsibility to turn off our preconceived notion. So one of the things that we can do is to hold ourselves accountable for doing the work that will allow us to establish rapport and to create the conditions in which we can learn from our clients, and that we can have them know that their voices are valuable because they are necessary in helping to move their process forward. And so that kind of gets us to, how do we build these bridges? How do we build these bridges? And I want to, before going through these, state that again, this was very ambitious in terms of a desire to cover a lot of this material in a short amount of time, but it was definitely designed to invite you to think, to start the process of thinking, and hopefully to commit to engaging in these practices, considering these things, considering the things that have been shared, and to develop practices that will help to build these bridges. And so how do we build these bridges? Ultimately, I would love to be able to tell you that I had a manual, that I had the answers, that I could give you the how-to. And I think that that is one of the barriers that we often encounter within the context of helping. You know, we're looking for the, in a perfect world, we would have the how to and it would work and it would be relevant, but we are all individuals existing within these contexts with these very deep experiences oftentimes. And, you know, it's more processed than it is kind of, here's what you do, step 1, step 2, and so forth. So become self-aware, be intentional to do self-work, look inward to know what and how you're thinking and how you are feeling, secure your own mass first and endeavor to do no harm to others. That's my recommendation, number 1. My second recommendation is build trust and be trustworthy. This looks like being open, honest, and genuine. Youth tend to prefer authenticity, and we can get further in support we can get further in our desire to support them and to help them in their journey when we are honest and genuine, being open to also learn from them. To that end, also build genuine relationships. Assume nothing and provide information. Assume nothing and provide information. Sometimes we assume that individuals have knowledge, skill sets, and experiences that they may not have. And so as we are engaging our clients and we are at the beginning of the relationship and as we are navigating terms of the relationship, let's be as detailed in our communication, in our informed consent, in our negotiating and co-constructing a plan toward desired outcomes. Let's do those things also. Ask questions. We can learn from others by asking questions, seeking clarification, and being willing to acknowledge what we don't know or understand. Comprehensive approaches that support continuity of care are important to building bridges, involving key players, and by involving key players, when we're thinking about those who we get to serve, let them tell us who the key players should be, as opposed to us automatically assuming who the key player should be. At the very least, there should be able to be a compromise there. And be open to help for yourself. Be open to help for yourself. And what does help for yourself look like? It may look like supervision. It may look like continuing education. It may look like counseling or therapy for the work that you do. Because at the end of the day, I did get a chance to see a number of the individuals weigh in terms of where you all are joining from. And I know you're doing important work that involves heavy lifting. You are literally being collaborators in helping folks to navigate some of the most challenging moments of their lives. And I think that it is important for us to also be willing to acknowledge when we need help. And that may be from a wanting to be more self-aware perspective, or even in terms of building on those things that our clients or our partners or consumers would be in need of. Some questions for us to consider are: what information are we gathering and how? Who gets information? How is it used and why? These are sometimes things that may be affected by bias, or there may be opportunities for us to take a critical look at how we're engaging and seek to do better. Evaluate who's on the team, and then think about what systemic change is needed and how do we get the ball rolling in order to move things in a direction to where that will allow us to remove barriers that may exist in order to build the bridges that will allow us to be connected and recognize that the most important part is to take the step that starts with you. sometimes the work that we need to do to be better for our clients, those who we get to serve, is to start with ourselves. And I have some recommendations on some things that might allow you to go a little bit deeper into considering some of the things that we talked about, or that I've talked about. There's a video series that New York Times has made available, as well as some others that really does a good job of talking about biases and recognizing the things that we carry. And there's some assessments where you can kind of find out, if you kind of where you fall as it relates to bias. Yeah. So those are some resources that should be available to you. I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to share. I will acknowledge that it's a little different sharing this in this virtual session, because I love for things to be as interactive as possible, but I really would like to thank you all for the opportunity to share. And I will, I guess, take questions if there's time. I don't know if we have time.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Russell. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now, but if we do need to move to break, our next presentation starts at 11:35. If anyone has a quick question, you can pop it in there and maybe Dr. Russell can respond directly.
Yes. I also had a feeling that this would go the full hour. And so I've provided my contact information. If anyone would like to follow up that way, feel free.
And you're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat right now.
Thank you all. Thank you all.